I've managed to make peace over this time, but that doesn't mean that I'm just gonna let it go.
So a couple of weeks ago, Harry very famously stated that he had to very reluctantly cut out half of his book, meaning he had 800 pages worth of content instead of the 400 that we all had to suffer through. Fascinating when you think about it. For someone who is quite young in the grand scheme of things, he's not even 40, and who hasn't really done much with his life other than party and travel, by his own admission, by the way, I learned this from Spare, to have so much wisdom and so many experiences to impart. Or so he would have you think, because surprise, surprise, the 400 pages of extra content were purely about his father and his brother. But he chose not to release it, very reluctantly, I remind you, because, to quote him, I don't think they would ever forgive me. The way that this revolution has been covered, with the media dubbing it as a thinly veiled threat against his father and brother, which, don't get me wrong, it is a threat. It's just not exactly very thinly veiled, is it? I mean, he definitely takes after his wife in that way. But you'd think that this was the first time that Harry or Meghan have engaged in this extortion tactic, when in reality, this has been their modus operandi since the very beginning. I would say way before Megxit, because let's not forget, there were a lot of behind the scenes threats. You know, we're gonna leave if you don't give us what we want, before the public even knew about it. Heck, if you consider Meghan herself, these threats started very early on in the relationship with Harry, as far back as 2016, because according to Valentine Lowe's book, Courtiers, which I have by the way, she gave him an ultimatum. Either you make a statement condemning the media and thereby confirming our relationship, making it official, or I dump you. Harry panicked, and lo and behold. So it's readily apparent to anyone who's been paying any attention over the past couple of years that their entire career is essentially an extortion tactic. So hearing about this, cutting out 400 pages out of a book and potentially implying, I suppose, that there is more content for a second book, that was hardly surprising given their track record. Initially, the majority of us genuinely believed that Harry was Meghan's victim or puppet. But over the past, I would say, year or so, it's become quite evident that he's actually her accomplice, her partner in crime. They're two peas in a pod, or as we like to say on this channel, two conjoined palm trees in a Montecito garden. These threats are a tale as old as time at this point. Cast your mind back to that now infamous interview that Meghan gave to The Cut. I made a whole video about that interview called The Blackmailer, so you can watch that if you haven't already. But the last few paragraphs of that interview were just essentially threat after threat after threat. And consider when this interview was released. Initially, the uproar was about how close this interview was released to the 25th anniversary of Princess Diana's passing, which a lot of people said was deliberate. And I am inclined to believe that, because nothing Meghan Markle does is a coincidence. But given that the Queen passed only a week essentially later, I mean, Princess Diana's anniversary is important and all, but these people released that interview knowing that the Queen was not only suffering from cancer, but on her deathbed. By Harry's own admission in the epilogue, I believe, of his book, he was in contact with the Queen at that time. He spoke to her on the phone, and one would assume that he had some indication of how sick she was. What Harry is doing with these comments is nothing new, including the bad timing. His father is still grieving the loss of his mother, all while also learning to navigate this new reign of his. And this is when his youngest son, his darling boy, as Charles loves to refer to him, decides to drop bomb after bomb after bomb, when his father is presumably at his most vulnerable. I mean, for people who constantly preach compassion and empathy, they sure are lacking in it, aren't they? There's also been a lot of talk, surprise, surprise, of a tell-all memoir of Meghan's own, which, based on her behavior on the Oprah interview, her comments in that Cut interview, and the comments on her own podcast, whenever this memoir is released, we can be sure that it will be filled to the brim with threats and stories of her heroism and martyrdom at the same time, which to us common folk commonly translates to mistruths. One of Meghan's favorite words, ironically. It's all needless, senseless, and entirely unprovoked. And I don't see this behavior, this extortion tactic, ending anytime soon, because given that they're both such vapid, tireless, talentless, and entitled brats, they'll never stop, because this is how they guarantee the moolah. And of course, staying relevant, because if this couple has demonstrated anything in the past few years, to them, it's better to be hated and reviled than to be ignored. These threats will probably never cease until the royal family gives in to their every single demand. Whether it's a public apology or assurances that they will never have their titles revoked or removed, a promise of their children getting titles and being styled as their royal highnesses, even though they live in Montecito and have nothing to do with the British monarchy at this point. They're American citizens as far as I know. And I also suspect that they want to revisit this half in, half out, have your royal cake and eat it too deal that the Queen rejected. Because now that the Queen's gone, the perception I'm getting personally, and that many commentators are getting as well, is that Charles is definitely softer than the Queen and is therefore more pliable. So perhaps they're hoping that they're gonna end up getting what they wanted all along, now that the Queen's out of the picture. Now, I could be wrong about the King, obviously. I don't know him, I've never met him, but the way that he's been reported to have been handling this and responding to the Sussexes has been quite disappointing, to say the least, assuming these reports are true. He's apparently reached out to the Archbishop of Canterbury to facilitate a negotiation between the Sussexes and King Charles. The irony here being that this is the same Archbishop who Meghan threw under the bus and essentially accused him of committing a crime when she lied publicly in front of millions of viewers during that Oprah interview by stating that he secretly wed them 3 days before the wedding in their backyard, which is illegal in the UK. Despite all of that, I'm hearing reports that the Archbishop is actually a huge fan of Meghan's, which I suppose, if true, falls in line with this narrative or this notion of Meghan being able to charm men, specifically older men. They seem to be very susceptible to her charms, at least that's what Tom Bower seems to think. And this unfortunately includes, like I just said, the Archbishop of Canterbury, but also the King himself. Charles was said to be very enamored and charmed by Meghan. Now, I already made an entire video addressing this issue of the coronation and inviting the Sussexes and why I believe it's inappropriate given that it's a state affair. But that was before the Archbishop's apparent involvement. Now look, as I said in The Traitor, even though I'm not a parent myself, I completely understand and acknowledge that the King would want his youngest son present at such an important day. But what I don't understand is why the King is going so far, to such extreme lengths, if these reports are to be believed, to do something that the majority of his subjects are not in favor of. And to add fuel to the fire, something that, in my opinion, as I mentioned in The Traitor, undermines William's position. William doesn't want Harry there if the reports are to be believed. And rightfully so, after what he's done to him, and his wife, and his children, his little girl Charlotte, and his entire family as a whole, his country, his monarchy. This isn't some laughing matter. This isn't a small scuffle between brothers that, William is holding a grudge over. This has become, unfortunately, a global laughingstock at this point. Another example of how far, King Charles is going to make sure that Harry attends is this so-called 48-hour prince plan, where Harry's going to be very quickly ushered in and out, just for 48 hours to attend key events of the coronation, with the idea being that he'll be there, but for the least amount possible to limit any damage or, I suppose, negative coverage, negative publicity, and negative reactions from the crowds. However, the glaringly obvious problem with this plan is that 24 hours, let alone 48, heck, a couple of hours, were more than enough for Harry to backstab his father and his brother by divulging an intimate, private conversation that he had with the two of them. A mere, half an hour, a few hours after Prince Philip's funeral in his book, Spare. Of course, with the intention of making them look bad. If that's not enough for you, remember that very quick and discreet meeting that Harry had with the Queen last year? I believe it was in April, on his way to The Hague for the Invictus Games. What did he end up doing after that meeting? He ended up arranging a sit-down, one-on-one interview for a US network, in which he did the very same thing. He divulged the contents of that private meeting and discussion with the Queen. When you're dealing with people with no morals, even a minute, heck, a second is too much. Now, proponents of the king's efforts to make sure his son and potentially his wife are in attendance at the coronation state that this is important because the monarchy has always signified unity and harmony. And so if Harry and his wife aren't there, then what kind of a message would that give to, the nation and potentially even the rest of the world? I mean, look, I think that ship has well and truly sailed, because it's all well and good to preach that and to try to signify such a good message. But as with everything else in life, there is a limit. I certainly don't recall there being this much outrage against the Sussexes' attendance at the Platinum Jubilee, for example, only last year, because despite everything they had already done up until last June, the limit wasn't reached. Yes, they were booed, but in the grand scheme of things, there wasn't an outrage over their attendance. Fast forward to September, when the couple were present at the funeral, and forget the funeral, at that walkabout. Honestly, the sight of them there made me feel physically ill, but when you look at the crowds who received them, they were welcomed back with open arms. They were hugged, they were given flowers. And this was right after the cut, which definitely made headlines. And despite all of that, the people of the UK were still willing to forgive and forget. I'm sure everyone at that time hoped that this would be a new beginning, a true chance to turn over a new page and start afresh. But boy, were they wrong about that, because little did all of us know, I'm sure we expected it, but we didn't know that they were just getting started. But now, after the book and after the Netflix docuseries, enough is enough. The people have had enough. The limit has been reached. Even the Americans are disgusted. Disgusted at the Sussexes' relentless lust for money, power, and revenge. At the end of the day, I think one thing is absolutely clear. If the Sussexes are given any access to the royal family, no matter how minimal, whether it's 48-hour prince, 24 hours, or 2 minutes, they will be given enough content to twist and exploit and add to their arsenal, to their inventory of extortion tactics. And the sad thing is, at this point, the Sussexes will probably win either way. Because if they get what they want and the royal family bows to their every whim, then obviously they're winning in that regard. But even if they don't get what they want, it's become very clear that their first and foremost priority is money. And their reputation, from the looks of it, has taken a back seat. Because I think perhaps maybe even they realize at this point that their reputation is absolutely in tatters and there's probably no going back. They're just in way too deep in this quest for revenge. And they've realized that they're getting paid very handsomely for it, millions upon millions for Netflix and the book. And make no mistake, they are going to milk this until the very last drop. It's depressing because I don't like seeing evil people get away with evil things and make millions, get rewarded for it, profit out of it. You know, it's illegal to profit out of crimes. If only lying and deception were criminal offenses. I mean, blackmail and extortion are, but obviously these two aren't gonna get charged with anything. I mean, let's not go that far. Anywho, my stomach's growling, so I'm gonna go shut it up.